Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lisa Honecker. I am the Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities, and I'm here to welcome you to our 2020-2021 speaker series, Continuing the Conversation, Race, Racism, and Anti-Racism. I want to talk briefly about the provenance of our series before we introduce our speaker, Dr. Molefi K. Asante. In May 2020, the Department of Africology and African American Studies at Temple University hosted a virtual seminar, Race, Racism, and Anti-Racism, Redefining the Social Contract, featuring 22 prominent Black scholar activists, including our own Pat Reed Merritt, who gave 10-minute presentations in their areas of expertise. Stockton is inviting a number of the Temple seminar presenters to continue this virtual conversation started in May with the Stockton community throughout this school year, with the blessing of the person who organized that seminar, Dr. Molefi K. Asante, whom our own Pat Reed Merritt will now introduce.
Thank you, Lisa. Hotep, it's my pleasure.
Hotep.
It's my pleasure to introduce to you my colleague, my friend, my brother, Dr. Molefi Kete Asante, whose list of accomplishments are so long and so tremendous. This 1-minute introduction will not do it justice. I will highlight a few things for you though. Dr. Asante is known as the father of Afrocentric thought, theory, and practice. He is renowned throughout this nation and the world. He has spent the last 4 decades promoting Afrocentric thought and Afrocentric practice. He's also known as the person who is the founder of the first PhD program in the nation that focuses on Africana Studies, African American Studies, or now the Department of Africology and African American Studies at Temple University. He is the author of more than 80 books. It's probably up to 90 by now, but he's a very prolific writer, a very prolific scholar. And again, he has been able to share his view, his conceptualization of what an Afrocentric world looks like throughout this nation and throughout the world. He is the individual, one of the leading intellectuals, again, in our country, who organized the webinar on race, racism, and anti-racism that received really a tremendous response. And so I am more than happy and pleased that Stockton University has decided to continue this conversation. Dr. Asante's work can be viewed not just on the internet, but you can find his books in all the bookstores, you can find his articles in all the journals, and you can certainly insert his name into the search and will come up with more than 200 references leading you to Dr. Asante. And so it's my great pleasure again to introduce Dr. Asante to you. And I think we're going to start by showing some of his comments from this webinar that he sponsored back in May. Is that correct, Dr. Allison?
Yes, we can do that in just a moment. I will have to cue it up and I will share screen. Okay, I will share those comments. And then we will hear live from Dr. Asante.
Hotep. Akwaba, and hello. Welcome to Temple University's Department of Africology's webinar on race, racism, and anti-racism, redefining the social contract. We appreciate certainly the support that we have received from the College of Liberal Arts. My name is Molefi Asante. I am professor and chair of the Department of Africology at Temple University, where we created the first doctorate in African American Studies. I am the author of 92 books, including Erasing Racism. I libate today to and for African ancestors brought to this land 400 years ago against their will. I do not forget the Lenape and their brothers and sisters who lost an entire continent to invasion. The genocide of the native peoples and the enslavement of Africans constitute the primal context for the continual killing of Black people, not only by police, but sometimes by ordinary white citizens. The outpouring of rage by intellectual activists, many of whom do not consider themselves public intellectuals because they were not made by the media, but by their consistent and persistent commitment to African liberation, culturally, politically, and economically, convinced me soon after the murder of George Floyd that there should be a platform for these profoundly brilliant thinkers to share with the public their thoughts and interventions about and for these times, conditions, social contract hierarchies, and anti-racist policies and behaviors. We could not accommodate all of the speakers who wanted to share this platform, but our aim was to let you listen to some of the most original thinkers of our day. In the future, we shall have other webinars and bring to your attention the significant work of other scholars and thinkers. I am grateful for the webinar format because the collective total of a conference of this type with these individuals would cost nearly $450,000 given their reputation and normal fees. Yes. Obviously, they are my friends and have not charged me or the university for their appearances. One day I shall repay them with a web visit. I also wish to indicate that we have 3 of our graduate students speaking today, and you will be pleased to see them. Each speaker will speak for no more than 10 minutes. Given the unusually dynamic nature of the topic, some will be tempted to do more and to say more, but our format will not allow it today. I will introduce each speaker. They will speak, and I will introduce the next speaker. Questions can be asked, and we will try to answer a few of them if we have a chance.
Okay, Dr. Asante, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Allison, and I want to thank Dean Honaker. Certainly want to thank my sister and colleague, Dr. Pat Reed-Merritt. I want to thank Stockton. I mean, I always say to people that Stockton in many ways is like another part of my family. I have been working with the university for several years, and I really appreciate all the intellectuals that and scholars that you have brought to us, and also the fact that you have also accepted a number of our PhD students, and we now have Toyo from your university, who is one of our teaching assistants. So we just really happy. I'm really happy to be here at Stockton and working on this project. And as the dean said, it is, of course, a pandemic to hit the United States of America since the flu of 1919. The structural and indeed the intellectual support for racism sped on by demonstrations after the murder on video of George Floyd by the Minneapolis police. Fortunately for me, where I live here in Philadelphia, I was able to witness, and also because I live in Center City, to participate in the tremendous outpouring of what it truly means to be anti-racist at heart. It seemed to me that millions of people across the United States had understood my former student Ibram Kendi's appeal for an anti-racist movement. Kendi has been clear in his call for more than being non-racist. One, he said, had to act in order to bring down the structures of racism. In his book, he tried to challenge us to look at policies and to see how things can change if we change policies. And I always say I like doing difficult things because, and this is truly one of the difficult things for those of us who are in this society, and it must be done if we're to sustain the nation itself. Many people have written on race, and they have spoken on race, and you see this in the journals and publications, and people have been out front in research surrounding race. In fact, nobody has been more out front than Pat Reed Merritt, and certainly Donatrice Allison and other scholars have done a lot of this work. I like to think that race is a problem, but the discourses most often, not with those that I've mentioned, but the most of them have rarely been about racism itself. And this is precisely why Kendi's work, I think, has resonated with the nation. What we have to do is to peel back the various skins on the onion of race to expose the underlying core of the problem. And I think that that is, to me, what is the problem, because the biological illusion of race is not only an invented farce, but it cannot be solved by a discussion about race only. I'm convinced by the literature and that the origin of race theories, the reaction of social scientists, and the practice of the masses that something more is generating the many racist symptoms that we see in society, as well as we experience every day. I call them the grand symbols of infamy, particularly with the monumental statues and the battlefields and the military camps and so forth, and the murder of African American people. There is a power in the slogan, I believe, Black Lives Matter, because it refers directly to the single most important attitude that calls it into being. And the question is, how did we get to this point in this society where race has been at the forefront of the lynching and killing of black people for centuries? How did this come about? Who established the rules of this game, and for what purposes? How can we understand covenants that were established by whites to exclude Africans and First Nations peoples from a social contract based on the false idea of whiteness? Who could have thought up that idea? What did the founding fathers really believe? What did various presidents of the United States believe and practice about the concept of race? Why did Donald Trump boast of the German blood and the German brain? What comedy must be endured to support this racist construction based on scientifically unsupportable claims? To me, the structure of the American society is clearly generating racist ideas as quickly as we think that we have dealt with one or the other of them. If we have a problem in education and the government passes certain legislation, we think that we have solved the problem, but we have merely postponed the real reckoning that must take place in the society. When we created African American Studies, we saw it as a grand move toward justice, that is, informational, cultural justice, but alas, I always say some even objected to that position. Oh, you don't need black studies, you don't need African American studies. My main point here is that there's a generator of all forms of racism, and even the false concept of race is found in the ancient story myths and history of patriarchy and hierarchy. These ideas sit at the beginning of all types of human suffering, from the enslavement of Africans to the Holocaust, from the decimation of the First Nation people to the American discrimination against Mexicans, to the treatment of women and various gender hierarchies. How to teach children and adults to be anti-racist must involve a new emphasis on breaking down the barriers surrounding the illusion of race, and a serious critique of ranking that leads to ascribing to individuals certain characteristics and values based on this false notion of race, or gender, or country of origin and ethnicity. The quest for humanity is the way forward to breaking through the ramparts of hierarchy surrounding country of origin or continent of origin. And I think this is, I just want to give a few historical comments and then I'll bring this to an end. The end of the Civil War in 1865 brought in a new possibilities for the African American or the African population. We became citizens after the war had ended. And I always say that before 1865, we were just Africans. When we became citizens, then there's a different reality. But the African population had been held in bondage for 246 years and always under the threat of brutal treatment for seeking freedom. Yet the promise has not been met, although despair has been held at bay by the persistence of resistance to inequality and the demonstrable value of protests against every type of violence. Although the current police forces, for example, are often credited with beginning their modern operations in the 1900s, these forces have ancestral units that run deep in the United States early history. The objective of the paddy rollers, you may have heard of this term, but the paddy rollers were armed white men during the enslavement who were employed to chase down and punish enslaved Africans in the southern states who tried to run away from bondage or who happened to be on a road or on a pathway without a certain pass from their enslavers. But after the Civil War and during the late 19th century and early 20th century, the police were used to monitor and control the immigrant populations in the northern cities. So it was not, now they started with mostly African Americans, and then they moved to, of course, patrolling and controlling the immigrant population. What appeared in 1865 to be a new day for Africans morphed into the old day as police who had been created to ensure that blacks in the South would remain on the plantation shifted, and afterwards it became the police force became a principal force in the control of northern cities, these urban cities. Later, with the rise of the migrant black refugees in northern cities seeking jobs while escaping the harsh conditions in the South, and with the rising numbers of, and I call this the rising numbers of non-white Europeans. This is very interesting terminology here. And I just thought of this morning. Non-white Europeans, such as Irish, Italian, and Jewish migrants, were also controlled. You have to read the books on how did the Irish become white, how Italians became white, how the Jews became white. There are a number of books written by sociologists because white Europeans over time became people in America, because America, of course, was a country based on this notion of whiteness. No other country in the world was at the time based on this. There's no nation like that. I mean, people had their own nationalities and so forth. But the police force was reinvented as an agency to maintain control by intimidation, to retain the concept of racial superiority of whites and racial inferiority of black people. As unacceptable as these ideas are at the current time among intelligent white people in this society, there still lurks the medieval idea of race ingrained for centuries in the mentality of many white people who are victims of false propaganda and who have declined to learn either from history or science. What caused the death of George Floyd, Trayvon Martin, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Freddie Gray, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Philando Castile, Tamir Rice, Oscar Grant, and scores of other black bodies murdered, often with mutilation of multiple gunshots? What caused this? During the time Africans were enslaved, there was little use of police forces for the masses of blacks, with the exception of those who patrolled the interstices between plantations. These were the paddy rollers, you see. Every black person away from a plantation and without permission of the slave owner, a slaveholder, could be stopped, could be questioned, could be brutalized as a punishment for being off of the plantation without permission. In fact, this became, in South Africa, it became the pass laws, the same thing. If you happened to be somewhere, any white person or white child could ask a black person, show me your pass. And if you didn't have one, you could be in trouble with the police. This was the pattern. Therefore, one can understand how difficult it was because there were so many black people who were either escaping or this had become an extensive force. Physical and psychological domination of black people had become such a part of plantation life as the horrific beatings, cutting off of fingers, damaging the Achilles tendon of those Africans who tried to run away. You've heard of the notion of the shuffling black enslaved person. And the reason that people walked around with dragging their feet like that was because often their Achilles tendons were cut. And so they wouldn't run away. And this, of course, became a badge of honor to see someone that later on became something that people call, well, these shuffling Negroes. Well, these shuffling Negroes were some of the most militant Negroes or black people. They were the ones who had been running away. And they said, well, they run away, and we catch them, so we just cut their Achilles tendon, you see, and so on. But after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, with the rise of white Southern vigilante movement, exemplified by the KKK, what we saw that it was still the same system, fear and pain in the black community, because the idea was, how do you ensure this notion of superiority? And you couldn't secure it wasn't naturally secure. You couldn't naturally secure it in any way. You had to secure it by force and by pain. My parents were born during this incredible period of time that painted their images of white people dressed in white sheets and hoods as devils, meaning no good for black people. That's what they saw. They, oh boy, these KK, this devil. But in Georgia, I grew up in southern Georgia, so you can imagine this. But the great scholar Shashi McIntyre wrote a book called Criminalizing a Race, Free Blacks During Slavery. And this is where I get lots of my information about the paddy rollers and so on. But in her book, she demonstrates that the English enslaved, killed, maimed, imprisoned, and exported to colonies many people, subjugated the Africans and barracoons, raped and murdered those who protested, and claimed that blacks, and always claimed that blacks were inferior. The exporters would even abuse the unenslaved blacks in northern cities A more recent book by Khalil Gibran Muhammad, The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America, also explains the nature of criminalizing black people by the police and the prison system. When there are more black people in prison today than were black people enslaved in 1850, it means the penalization for blackness, especially where blacks are likely to be the first arrested and the longest imprisoned, shows that the black body is under threat in a racist society. The problem with the concept of race, which most of us are agreed is not a scientific term, although racism has real consequences, is that race elevates the idea of perception of value, worth, character, and importance. And for me, it was not difference in people. People have always been different for a long time. There have been people with different hair textures, different complexions, different shapes of eyes, and so on for all the time. That has not been that's not a problem with humanity. That's the way humanity has been since people left the continent of Africa more than 70,000 years, rather 70,000 years ago. So that's not the problem. The problem is not the difference in people. Of so-called races on the basis of physical difference. That was the crime. And that's the crime that we have to deal with, because that's the crime that gives perception, so that the police who sees a black person has one way of thinking about that black person, particularly a black male or black female. Now, you see that person, and there is something that clicks in the brain, particularly of many white police, that said something is that person should not be here. You shouldn't be walking in this neighborhood. You shouldn't be driving in this neighborhood. You should, something clicks in the brain. And those are the perceptions that's based on this, what I call the racial ladder, the ranking of people by virtue of this false concept of race. That is our problem. That's the gaze of white people at the black body. Regardless to its position, posture, or pose, this gaze has already been corrupted by the ongoing philosophy of race hierarchy. And this is situated nowhere else except in the European mind. And it's been in the European mind since we've been in this country. A white policeman who sees a young black man in his early 20s seems willing to confront the black man with an aggression, not measured out to young white people in a similar circumstance. And this gaze, this is what Muhammad calls the condemnation of blackness. I believe this happens because the police are apt to have imbibed the intoxicant of race that counts black as inferior, more criminal, more vile, violent, and guilty than whites who are perceived to be at the top of the ladder. Now, Tommy Curry has pointed out that that those descriptions are not true in the first place. You just go back and look at the facts. And the question, and very interestingly, because this has been an evolution as well. Because during the enslavement, the whole idea of blacks was that blacks were meek, blacks, were shy, blacks, were scared, and that kind of thing. Now that whole thing has changed. And Tommy Curry shows how it changed by virtue of the different policies in the society. Black bodies are not inherently less than white bodies, but the gaze of a racist, even without consciousness of racism, what is often called unconscious bias, as with notorious RBG said, or disconscious racism, as Joyce King calls it, has been prepared by history, tradition, and ritual in the American society to punish blackness because of the assumption of negativity. This is why we have struggled with funding. For example, Temple University just agreed to give African American Studies $1 million worth of new initiatives and hiring and support for a new Center for Anti-Racist Research. They decided this last week, but we had requested right to George Floyd's murder. This is what I want to say about this, is that the only reason we had to struggle for funding that they didn't have to struggle for in criminal justice or psychology or political science. The reason we had to struggle is because, again, as I argued in my letter to the university administration, the perception that anything associated with black people must be tainted as inferior or negative is the reason that they don't support black things. You see, let me put it this way, that if you perceive black people as less than white people, then the question becomes, why should I give black departments, or black units, or black centers as much as we give white departments and centers? Why shouldn't the Black Studies Department have 10, 15, 20 faculty members? Why shouldn't that be? You mean we don't have as many subjects to teach? What are you talking about? It is only because the perception is the problem, and the perception has to be tied to the notion of race. That to me is problematic. That is the only thing that I can see. That anything tied to African people, black people, must be tainted with this negativity, unless, of course, it's sports or entertainment. Then you say, oh, yeah, they can do that, right? This is precisely why solving the issue of police brutality through using Ibram Kendi's notion of policies, because Ibram argues that the real issue is the policies, and if we could just change the policies, we'll be okay. But my idea is that won't necessarily prevent racist actions from breaking out in other sectors of the society. If we solve the police brutality issue tomorrow or today, then it is not only that symptom of police brutality that must be studied and isolated and crushed, but the hierarchy of races. That is the concept that I think is one that is really probably grounded in the machinery of ancient patriarchy. So this is a decades-long struggle, but it must be engaged in order to elevate humanity over all forms of racial rankings. When our gaze is upon a human, it will not matter what is the complexion, the creed, the gender, the hair texture, the eye shape, the nose shape. These are only specifically significant in terms of cultural origin and activity. And you can say, oh, that person comes from Turkey. Oh, that person comes from Ghana. Humanity is shared and appreciated without reference to racial ranking is our best hope. In fact, it is the only hope, it seems to me. I just want to end there and say thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Asante. I'm going to open it up for participants to ask questions. And I was going to start it off with a question while I wait for people to type in the Q&A. We lost you a couple of times, so there was something that I wanted to have you.
Okay.
Yeah, just the sound went out a little bit, and so the question that I will start with has to do with what you were just saying. So there was another talk that I heard you give, and you made a statement about even if and I'm paraphrasing, but you said something like, even if an organization changes its diversity, right? That even they hire somebody at the top that is a person of color, the system could still remain a racist system.
Yes.
If the system doesn't change? And so you were touching on that a little bit just now when you're talking
Yes.
about police departments.
Yes.
Can you speak to that a little bit again, just in terms of what that means, that it's not just about hiring a person of color as the head of something?
I really appreciate that question, Dr. Allison, because I think it hits the core of what I'm talking about the structure itself and the system of hierarchy. And I take that this way. If you have, I'll give you a personal example right now. I'm a consultant for a large corporation because they also are responding to Black Lives Matter. And the CEO of this company said to me, said, you know what? He said, we have, but he said, but and he's a white guy. He said, as to anti-racist, they don't seem to make much difference. He said, and I can understand the task, he says, because they're on a board with 25 other people who are white. So he said, my task, he said, what I want you to tell me, how do I change the system? So it's the same thing. And part of it is, how people get on the board, who brings people on the board, and so on. What is that structure? And where do they come from, and what's their perception of blackness? That is the key. And I told him that it's not just white people. You need to ask that question to black people. The black people you put on the board. You put a black person on the board who also has a perception of black as being vile and negative and whatever, then you're going to get the same results you would have gotten if you had an all-white board. So part of this thing, the issue that I'm talking about, is that there are people now, blacks as well, who have imbibed this notion of the perception of blackness as being inferior. And that is what has to be battled against, too. You can have that in African American studies departments. You can have black people. Oh, you say, they got a black person. Yeah, but being a black person, whether you're a president or provost or dean, doesn't necessarily mean that you understand the complexity of the situation in the society. And I think that in terms of the system, the system keeps generating. That's why I say that really, to me, the issue that we have to attack, because it's an issue that's at the heart of these issues, these what I call these marginal issues that we deal with, whether they're about race or religion or gender and so on. We deal with them because we don't see the human being who walks through the door as a human being. We see them by virtue of what the society has taught us to see them. They're black, or they're transgender, or they're this, or they're that. But I see human beings as human beings. That's the way I deal with human beings. They're human beings. And if you're a human being, then how do I come up with this? I can't come up with that. I don't even understand how a person can see them. I had a colleague, a white colleague. I was chair of the communication department at Buffalo, SUNY Buffalo, State University of New York, in the 1970s, right? I was chair of this department. There was a who was known by all students, white students told me this, and black students. He could never give a black student more than a C. He just didn't think. This is his thought. He just couldn't think that a black person was capable of doing more than a C grade. That's crazy. But that's the notion of perception. You Italian student or a Jewish student. No, Jews can't make more than a C. No, you can only do that if you have created this environment where you do that. Like in Nazi Germany, they could say, okay, with Jewish people, you can only do that when you create that. And people to participate. So part of what we've got to do in terms of the institutions is that we've got to attack the notion of patriarchy and hierarchy so that we have a society, equality, and a sense of justice, and a sense that we all human beings. And we can deal. That doesn't mean, because I'm an Afrocentric, it doesn't mean that we can't deal with culture. It's a whole different thing. You know, there is an African American culture. There's an African culture. There's a history and a tradition. There's the Iranians, the Persians have a history and a tradition. Those things you can deal with as real things. But this notion of racial classification on the basis of certain traits as intelligence and now, because it's crumbling in many places, people are beginning to see it. And that's why Black Lives Matter is so important. It said, you know what? Black people, our lives are like human lives. Our lives matter. Because what has happened with this perception of all other lives away from Black lives. So the Black people, we're saying, hey, wait a minute. Your life is no better than my life. And I ought to be treated the same. You ought to be treated the same as they treat me. That is a big issue. Oh.
Okay, Dr. Asante?
Thank you.
Okay, you froze a
Yes.
little bit, but I have more questions. The questions are rolling in, and we have about 11 minutes. So I'm going to ask you a few of these questions.
I'll speak quickly. Okay.
Okay, so one question asks, what is the importance of studying African American studies in the context of current events? And how can Black Studies scholars and students in this field use their knowledge of Black history and intellectual theories and paradigms of the field to affect real change?
All right. Well, that question will take the 11 minutes. No. I was joking. I was saying that question will take 11 minutes, but I'll be quick if I can. First of all, I think that kind of studies, what it does is it provides a real historical understanding of the American society itself. Because you can't really understand American law, American medicine, American economics, the role that the enslavement of the African played. If you try to understand it, you won't understand where the tax structures came from. You won't understand where medicine. At one time, let me give you a quick thing, and then we learned this in terms of theories. Afrocentric theories always teach you to ask the question, what was the agency of the Black people? What did Black people do? Not what happened to us by outside forces. We can talk about that in terms of resistance, but what did we actually do? At one time in this country, most of the medical practitioners were Black people. And it's very hard to imagine that. Most of the people who were doing medicine, and particularly in terms of women, in terms of midwifery, most of the people, Black or white, were Black women. They were the ones bringing the children into the world, white children and Black children, throughout America and then deeply in the South. But what happened was that the white male establishment created a system that meant that in order to practice medicine, you had to go to medical school. In order to get certain licenses, and therefore basically wiped out the Black medical people. So this notion of when you start talking about Africana studies, you begin to see how these things emerge. But I think how it helps people I know my white students have always come to me and say, you know what, I never knew this stuff. I never learned this in my high school. They never taught anything, not even about, they didn't even teach us hardly about any of the so-called heroic black people. We didn't know these things. So that's how I see it.
Okay. Thank you. These are a lot of these are complex questions that take
I
time.
know.
I might have to have you do, kind of write something up to some of them. One of them asks, what do you suggest companies do to truly become diverse and inclusive?
Well, the first thing that companies have to do is they have to have leaders or CEOs or presidents who are committed. If the president are committed, like the one CEO that brought me into his company to change his company, he says, "Look," he said, "I'll tell you." He said, "I'll tell you something." He says, "I've been here for 16 years, the CEO." He says, "One day I woke up after the George Floyd murder. I woke up and I said, I'm not a racist. I know I'm not a racist, but I looked at my company and I have 2,000 employees, and I looked at all the international levels of my company, and I could not find one African American vice president. And I got 52 vice presidents and directors, and I could not find one." He said, "I asked myself, what the hell am I doing? I'm part of the problem." So that's why he went out and said, "Look, you know what? I want this company to change. So you got to have somebody to effect change. You have um, into PhD program in Africana Studies at Temple, but Dick Englert, Richard Englert, the other day, he just simply said, "You know what? We have got to do something creative and something big to show not just that we are anti-racist, but also to show that we believe in equality and justice. So we're going to make an infusion in African American studies." You got to have a big thinker like that. If you don't have a big thinker, it will not happen. The people down below won't do it. So you've got to have a big thinker who will say to the deans and the provosts, "This is the vision that we see for the future." That in a corporation, then you will do as the CEO I mentioned to you, who said to me, he said, "First thing I need to do," well, I said to him, "First thing you need to do is get a point man or woman who can really take this on for yourself, and you give them complete authority to change it. You've got to have targets for hiring. You've got to hire in the right places. You've got to partner with HBCUs. You've got to partner with African American Studies departments. You have got to change the nature of how people are brought into the institution, the hiring system. You've got to change not only the hiring system, but the promotion system. Why is it that people leave and don't stay? And all this, so it's a big job, but it can be done.
Right. Thank you. I have we got about 5 minutes, so let me get a couple more in here. So there's a question about the K through 12 school system, and the question is, how do we get a holistic curriculum incorporated in our K through 12 school system?
Well, first of all, somebody has a right to curriculum. So that's the first thing. You've got to have a curriculum that you want to have, but they're already curricula. So part of what has to happen, even with the curriculum that they may have, is that it may have to be infused with African content, African American and African content. That sometimes can work as well. If you're teaching mathematics, there's no reason why, for example, you introduce the possibility that there are other ways of looking at math. And if you do that, then you can say, okay, well, the Yoruba, they count 2 by 2 rather than 10 by 10. So you can do all kinds of things with that. If you're doing literature, there's no reason why you shouldn't start with African literature, since it's the first literature, particularly starting with stories. So you can integrate almost any kind of field. You can infuse this content. What this does, it helps to break down that notion that blackness somehow is at the bottom of this so-called race.
Okay. I have one more question. I wasn't able to get to all of them, but just in order so that we can touch a variety of areas, there's a question about the healthcare system. And if you feel the ways that you feel the healthcare system negatively affect African Americans, and how can we deal with these disparities?
That question is probably out of my purview of knowledge. Really, I think it's a big question and it's a complex one, and there are people who know much more about that than I do. And my wife is one of those people. She's a registered nurse, but I can't. My own situation is that I don't. I know the inadequacies, but I'm not smart enough to say how we can deal with that healthcare system.
Yeah, I think it stemmed from the fact that there was a recent study that came out that talked about how I think it was Black children and Black babies had a better survival rate when they had Black doctors. So I think that it was kind of stemming from that.
That's connected to what I'm talking about perception. You're perfectly right. That's right. It's I can see that very much. So how the Black, there's so, I think I read some where there's studies that where when Black people say that they're in pain, they don't, white doctors don't see that as significant or something like that. I'm sure there are more detailed studies. One of our PhD students, former PhD students, Catherine Bankole Medina, who has written several books, but her dissertation was on slave medicine. That is the development of America's medical field with the experimentation on enslaved Africans, and particularly the horrible history of what Africans were put through, and I think that has probably become. It's still, some of that is still in the system. I'm not, but as I say, I'm not really an authority on it.
Thank you. Well, we are at 1:30. I don't know if Dean Honaker or Dr. Pat Reed Merritt had any final questions, but there have been several people simply thanking you on the Q&A and just thanking you for your time and thank you for speaking to the Stockton community. So I wanted to relay that.
I certainly do have a final question before he leaves. And Dr. Asante, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. And I understand the point that you're making about the false concept of race. But you also emphasize, as we all know, while race is socially constructed, humanity is in fact diverse. We have diversity. Human beings are not monolithic. So my question would be, how do we talk about that diversity, significance of that diversity, eliminating the concept of race? And I also understand the point you're making about the ranking of race, which is the racist part, where the racism comes in. But at one point you said, for some people, perception, they see blackness and they see negative. I don't want to see the negativity, but I want you to see my blackness. I want you to acknowledge that I'm a member of a particular group, of a particular culture with a particular history. You might not call me a member of a racial group, but I am a member of a group. How do we have those kinds of discussions, if I made myself clear?
Yeah. This is a very good question, and I think I touched a little bit on that. And in fact, I'm writing a book on this right now. Actually, how we deal with that is with culture. That the issue is culture. That you come from a particular culture. That when I'm in Brazil and I see my come from a particular African Brazilian culture that's similar to mine, but is a little. They have different ancestors. They have their rituals are a little different. Then you can when I'm talking to a Ukrainian student at Temple, there's a whole thing that's different when I'm talking to a Ukrainian student than I'm talking with a Scottish student, even though both of them are considered Europeans. You see, so they have national cultures and then they have regional cultures. And African descent, and I have a profound culture. It's the notion of creating, and then a person who could be an African person there are people I know who, if you look at them, you may say biologically they must have more European ancestors than they have African ancestors, and yet their culture they practice is African. So you know that that's a cultural thing. Walter White, who is the executive secretary of the NAACP, was often mistaken for a white man, but he was a black man. So what is that about? It's about his culture. He was the one who did investigations of racist attacks in the South and so forth. So that's the way I talk about it. I talk about it as culture. There are cultural differences, but we don't even place any ranking on those cultural differences. But you don't place any right who's above who. I mean that is not and it's based on color or hair texture or no. I don't do that. That's what we don't do. So and in fact, that's a little pretending. I think you have to deal with the question of the diversity and the question of the difference of the way people look, but not on racial ranking. And some people have said that the notion of anti-racist is a wrong notion, that maybe we should talk about racism or something. But anyway, that's another discussion, another intellectual discussion. But thank you so much. And thank Stockton and thank you, Dr. Allison and Dr. Lisa Hanukkah. Thank y'all very much. I appreciate it very much being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Asante. You've got lots of thank yous online, and one person made a plug for the fact that people should know that you can be on their dissertation chair even if they're not at Temple. So you might receive several requests as an outside person.
Thank you so much. I appreciate all of you.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
All right. Thank you very much. I got another Zoom.
Don't be
thank you very much.
Bye, Dr. Asante.